Hi everyone, thank you for joining us today. I hope you're all doing well. My name is Karen Hurst. I work in the PLSA's policy team. We're really pleased to be bringing you this session along with our friends at CACIS. We'll be looking at sustainable governance, which is obviously a hugely important issue. In particular, we'll be looking at cost transparency and also ESG, which, as we look towards TCFD, is certainly something I think we're all considering. I'm really pleased today to be joined by Scott Foster, who's a product specialist for cost transparency at CACIS, and also Pat Sharman, who's the UK Managing Director at CACIS. I should just say it's a live session today. We've got a lot to get through. We'll try and make some time for some questions at the end, so you can pop them into the Q&A box. If we don't have time for any questions or we don't get around to them all, we will try and get back to you. So please do put in any questions or comments that you have. But with that, we can get started, and I'll hand over to yourself, Pat.
So thank you, Karen. As a trustee of a small DC scheme, I believe that sustainable governance has never been so important in protecting members' pension pots. It includes three core areas: cost transparency, ESG risks, and climate risks. I actually view cost transparency in the same way as ESG and climate governance, because effectively understanding and managing cost also has a key impact in protecting members' pension pots. Guy Opperman recently commented that social factors must be at the heart of pension schemes' ESG strategy. With so much noise around environment and climate change, as trustees, I agree we must not lose sight of the social and governance risks. And actually, for me as a trustee, managing costs is a key part of my social and governance responsibilities. We'll be placing a lot of emphasis in this webinar on ESG and climate change, as there's potential significant impact to pension scheme investments, which need to be considered as carefully as both risks and potential opportunity. So what we want to do today is actually begin with the subject of cost transparency, which is becoming more established as a core part of the governance process for pension schemes. But before I hand over to Scott, Mel Duffield, the chair of the CTI group, has been kind enough to provide some insight into the recent progress of the CTI, which is, of course, an important part of sustainable governance. So over to you, Mel.
Hi all, welcome to this webinar today. I'm delighted that under the sustainable governance umbrella, we're going to be shining the spotlight on cost transparency. I've been the chair of the CTI board since it was first established in late 2018. And as a board, we're obviously really keen to understand now how well the CTI templates and framework are embedding in the industry. And we know that many schemes will now be entering their second full cycle of using the templates. We published a research report that reported increasing levels of take-up from schemes. So 8 out of 10 schemes that were surveyed said they were using the framework. And we also got really positive feedback around the ease of accessibility and ease of understanding of working with the framework. We know schemes are going to be moving from those first phases where the emphasis is very much on data collection and data quality assurance towards delivering tangible benefits, but that this doesn't happen overnight. It requires schemes to have confidence in the benchmarking information they're receiving and also signposting towards the potential actions that they can consider through their governance channels on the back of analysing that data. I've been really encouraged talking to my colleagues in USS and USIM in recent weeks about their experience of using the CTI templates second time round. They've told me that they're seeing much quicker response times from managers, and also that the data quality that's coming back is much improved compared to the first cycle last year. And hopefully that's being replicated right across the industry. The feedback from our research did point to some areas where there's room for improvement. So for example, tackling the areas of property funds, illiquids and funder funds, where there are some limitations with the templates currently. Also providing additional guidance around areas like the timescales it should take to complete the templates, and also how to calculate some of the very specific types of costs. The CTI board is actually going to meet again later this week, and we'll discuss our priorities for the next year, building on the feedback and the lessons learned that we've heard about from the research. I really hope you enjoyed the PLSA and CACEIS webinar today, and thank you so much again for your interest in cost transparency.
So thanks for that, Pat, Mel. It's really great to get an update from Mel, and this transitions nicely into what we're seeing on the ground, working with a lot of CTI data and CTI templates that are coming into us at CACEIS as a utility provider of cost transparency and benchmarking services. You know, transparency is in everything that we do. It's the new normal in all facets of governance. And for cost transparency specifically, we've reached a 2-year milestone since the CTI was formed and templates published in the industry. In those 2 years, we've seen a 65% increase in the use of the CTI templates from around 10% in 2019 to now 75% of all cost data submissions in 2021. And in the last year as well, we've seen an increase in the timeliness of submissions coming into us from asset managers. And that to us is a real indicator of familiarity, engagement, and ease of data transfer between asset managers and asset owners as they start to request more and more of this cost data. So the CTI use is increasing, familiarity is increasing, and it's all heading in the step in the right direction. There are some managers behind the pack, sort of typically overseas niche asset classes, who typically revert back to the sort of bespoke and legacy formats in submitting cost data. However, there is mapping available to map that data from the legacy formats into the CTI templates so that you have a sort of consistent like-for-like standard when collecting and reporting on your cost data across all the asset managers and asset classes that you work with as a pension scheme. So the CTI templates are ambitious. The breadth and the depth of the CTI covers around 200 data fields across all asset classes. And this is really great for more transparency for pension schemes. But that ambitiousness can also cause areas of concern around the quality of the data that's being reported. And here, vigilance is really, really needed when collecting that data and reporting that up to your boards and eventually to members. In our experience at CACEIS, only 10% of data coming into us from asset managers is first time right. And that is a startling statistic that we're starting to find on the CTI templates itself, a variance in how transaction costs are being reported, ongoing charges are being reported, and even contextual data being reported on the CTI templates. And all those key elements are crucial to value for money assessment. So it's imperative that the right questions are asked and enough sort of data analysis and cleansing goes into the CTI templates before they're reported up and actions sort of made on that cost data. To be clear, costs are not a bad thing. They just need to be analyzed and viewed in the context of the scheme strategy and various mandates employed. And that's a step of a good governance process.
So Scott, some really good positive improvements here, both in the take up of the CTI templates and also the timeliness. So great to see. But as a trustee, my main concern still has to be the accuracy of this cost information so I can make the right and informed decisions on these costs. So can you actually give us some tips or some insight as to how we can achieve this improve this accuracy of the cost information received?
Yeah, that's quite right, Pat. And as I mentioned, the CTI template is very ambitious. It's got 200 data points as a sort of maximum across the full range of asset classes. And to be clear, these costs aren't necessarily new costs. They've always been there. They've just never typically been reported or reviewed in a consistent and holistic way that the CTI now provides the industry. And so that's really good progress to have those templates. But in analyzing that data and cleansing that data and making sure that the data is as accurate as possible, we've done a case study at CACEIS across 265 billion worth of pension assets across DB, DC, LGPS schemes across 250 different asset managers and over 2,000 different funds. And what we're finding is that with stronger governance, and by that I mean checks, controls, a defined process, you can uncover 20 to 25% more cost data simply by asking the right questions. And that might be things on transaction costs. You know, you've got a missing implicit costs figure on that CTI template being received from an asset manager. You know, query that. Why is it zero? Is it zero? Is that zero valid, or is there a number behind it? The same thing can happen on ongoing charges as well. And manual input errors can lead to, you know, the management fees being missing on that CTI report. And, you know, there are teething issues with this new sort of new template and sort of new regulatory guidance. But yeah, as I mentioned, data governance and a robust process and vigilance is key to making sure you uncover that full total cost of ownership when collecting cost data across the full range of your asset managers. And so what we're talking about on cost transparency is just what we see as a sort of governance cog that fits into that holistic, responsible investor ethos in seeking to improve trust, transparency, and ultimately protection of member pots. And we've got a lot more information on, you know, how you can drill down into the CTI template and the cost transparency topic. Specifically, we've developed a made simple guide with the PLSA, which you can reference on the PLSA website. And of course, these slides and that guide can be made available to share after this session.
So thanks, Scott. So that's a great update from you and Mel as to exactly where we are. And so loads of improvements, loads of progress, and just some work still to do. But we know that cost transparency is just really one part of the sustainable governance toolkit for us trustees. So what I'd like to do now is actually to move on to ESG and climate risks. So if we could move on to that sections of the slide pack, that would be great. So this slide is just about setting the scene as to where we are from an ESG and climate risk perspective. So the UK is actually ranked as the 17th highest in global share of CO2 emissions. So actually quite relatively low. However, UK pension assets are valued at 2.58 trillion, third largest pension sector in the world. So UK pension schemes are actually massively exposed and also in a unique position of influence in addressing ESG and climate risks. As trustees, we have to disclose financially material considerations towards ESG and climate change in our SIP. We have to publish them. If you're a DC scheme, you also have to produce an implementation statement. And that's in addition to how we encourage our asset managers to align with our ESG policies. And also, we have to ask our asset managers to describe voting behaviours, which also raises the ongoing discussion of voting if you invest in pooled funds, but that's a discussion for another day that we'll cover. And schemes over 5 billion in size from October this year will have to report on climate risks in line with the TCFD guidance. So given this responsibility as a trustee myself, I certainly want to see clear evidence from my asset managers that there's clear action being taken on ESG and climate change. For DB schemes, it's also understanding how the sponsor employers is seeking to address these climate risks, because it's also an important part of assessing the strength of the covenant. The most important aspects from all of this, I need to go back to it, is to protect the members' pension pots from ESG and climate risks. And last but not least, just to add on to all of that for us trustees, we have to think about member engagement and communication around ESG and climate risks. We're going to touch on that, why that's important later on. So as trustees, and I think just as a pension sector and ourselves, we all advocate the importance of saving into a pension scheme at an early age. However, we also need to apply the same thinking in respect of climate change. Because of those companies we invest, they need to be thinking about allocating capital to address climate risks at the earliest possible opportunity. The longer they leave it, the more challenging it will become. And this will become a massive risk to member pots. So next slide, please. So just to touch a little bit on a survey that we undertook with the PLSA last year. So looking at pension scheme members, it's not a surprise that most members are not aware of what their pension scheme is doing in respect of managing climate change risks. And because there's a lack of data, it's not a surprise that the majority of members are not aware of the carbon emitted as a result of their investments. However, as trustees, we need to really realise that people are now becoming more aware of climate risks to our planet and the impact to our everyday lives. And they will start linking this to their pension pots. And they will expect more information on how schemes are tackling climate change risks to the pension scheme. So Scott, the results to the right of this slide actually demonstrate the data challenge for trustees. So how do we tackle this?
Yeah, it's a good question. It's definitely a challenge for pension funds and its trustees to manage. And we did a PLSA survey on ESG with a range of UK pension schemes, and the results clearly show the demand for ESG data, and that current sources of ESG data aren't enough. Data gaps are also clear. Getting hands on more data is needed to get started on addressing and identifying the challenges, both from an ESG and sort of climate risk perspective for the scheme. And as well as that, accessibility and transparency of that data is key to making a start on all of these really important topics. And I would just say and highlight that the ESG data and climate change data is imperfect at the moment, but the more you can get your hands on in terms of reporting, source data, and challenging your service providers for more data that your scheme needs is a great way to start. And with that data in hand, schemes, I think, are in a better position to understand their overall baseline risk from an ESG risk perspective, any potential breaches, any product involvement, and as well as that, carbon metrics that fit into that TCFD, which we're going to talk about a bit later. And once you have that baseline understanding across your portfolio as a scheme, you can subsequently begin to manage and monitor the investments at portfolio, fund, and underlying sort of holding ISIN level as well. And to strengthen that governance even further, we really believe that independent reporting can strengthen governance here as well, and that will help schemes basically create a level playing field with your asset managers when starting to collect and challenge ESG risks, exposure, and overall sort of carbon data as well. So I think the key message on that one is, certainly think big. There's a lot to manage. You've got to start small, but most importantly, make a start. And so moving on to the next slide, please. We're on the sort of forces driving change for trustees around ESG and climate change risks. And I think it's really been made clear by the TPR, things like the Paris Agreement, commentary from Guy Opperman, and UK legislative targets, all pointing to one direction of travel. And that is that ESG and climate change is here to stay. And it's something that pension schemes need to consider. It's not just a fad, and it's increasingly becoming a part of regulatory and risk management factors that must be effectively integrated into a scheme's overall governance process. If you look on the right-hand side, there's a chart there that clearly identifies the greenhouse gases emissions gap of a scenario now, sort of without any action, and scenarios with change and different levels of implementation, hitting a 2-degree target or 1.5-degree target. And certainly that gap needs to close if we want to keep in line with things like the Paris Agreement and UK government targets. And I think the challenge just got even bigger after the recent sort of G7 announcement, in which countries including the UK, the US, Canada, Japan, France, Italy, Germany announced a more stringent and ambitious target of tackling climate change in moving their policies to keep in line with the 1.5 degrees warming relative to pre-industrial temperatures. And this implies an acceleration of overall decarbonization targets by 2030 to achieve that net zero target of by 2050. And that piece will really place additional pressure on companies, on issuers, and underlying companies to cut their emissions, decarbonize, and transition into that low carbon economy. And the risks of not doing so are certainly important to monitor. And that includes all the underlying companies within your portfolios as well. And so from a UK pension funds perspective, global targets are set, regulations are in the SIP, implementation statement, TCFD reporting, they're all here and they must be considered by schemes. And as Pat mentioned, although around the 17th in global greenhouse gas emissions, globally, pension scheme assets do represent trillions worth of assets around the world, and the investment reach is global. Pension schemes are exposed to the risks, but are in a unique position to identify opportunities and influence change in addressing ESG and climate change risks, in line with the whole mantra of doing well whilst doing good. And so, Pat, on that note, how do you, as a pension scheme trustee, consider climate risks?
So thanks, Scott. So to the next slide, please. So I put these into two main categories: physical risks and transition risks. So what do I mean by that? So the physical risk is the rise in carbon causing extreme and disruptive events, which actually are disruptive events for supply chains and companies, creating higher risk, higher costs and volatility, which then translates into direct impact to the bottom line and to financial markets. Whereas the transition risks are more related to companies moving to a low carbon environment, mainly driven by governments targeting net zero by 2050. But this has created a transition risk. So for example, high carbon companies that do not adapt may be left behind in the low carbon transition. And again, higher costs and higher risk can impact their stock prices. So these are things that we need to think about as trustees. However, what's a real surprise is that carbon emissions can actually impact all sectors, which Scott will talk through later, but something as trustees we really must consider. What physical and transition risks do mean is that there'll be winners and losers across sectors. Like I've said, this is not just one sector, and companies. And we as trustees need to ensure that our asset managers are managing these risks. So Scott, being a trustee, how can we actually quantify the impact of these climate change risks to our pension schemes and the underlying assets and potentially the member pots?
Yeah, thanks, Pat. So I think quantification is certainly a challenge, and the results of our PLSA ESG survey also highlighted that as well. In that 71% of respondents in that survey felt that climate change would have a moderate to low impact on their scheme's overall investments. And recent studies are going to show the contrary, and what we have on slide is going to build on that. And so the risks that you highlighted, Pat, on physical risks as a result of climate change, well, according to a study of Munich Reinsurance, the global cost of extreme weather events linked to and exacerbated by climate change is in the range of $210 billion US in 2020, and that's a 26% increase year on year. And these costs are expected to rise as the frequency of extreme weather events increases, and the biggest risks are actually weighted towards Asian economies out east, who are less likely to be insured. And so that's on the physical risks, certainly a large impact to companies, overall global supply chains, and things like that. And when we focus specifically on climate change and transition risks, here we've pulled a paper, which was a sort of joint analysis study conducted by Ortec Finance, Cambridge Economics, and this Institute and Faculty of Actuaries. And they found that compared to a baseline scenario of no climate change mitigation whatsoever, and 3 climate scenarios, Paris orderly, Paris disorderly, and a failed transition scenario, all 3 climate scenarios increased the funding risk for UK pension schemes. It increased the time taken to reach full funding. And the Institute and Faculty of Actuaries actually highlighted that they believe that UK pension schemes may be systematically underestimating the funding risks they face, as current actuarial models don't currently make explicit adjustments for climate change risks. They also identified that sponsoring employers' exposure to climate change risks is relevant, which Pat highlighted on the previous slide. So, the results are clear. Physical risks and transition risks will, have a detriment to a pension fund's overall funding and impact its overall investments. And having to account for that in the overall strategy of the pension scheme is crucial to good governance and managing, member pots. And it should seriously be considered as a part of sort of overall risk management for the scheme. And I would really recommend reading the paper in more detail if you're really interested to learn more about the methodology and the findings within that. And I think if we move over to the next slide, I think this just makes it even more clear. Sources of carbon, it's in all sectors. Trustees need to understand, the overall carbon emissions generated from their underlying investments as a part of the TCFD reporting requirements. And as the world moves from fossil fuels to renewables in that sort of energy transition, it's going to have a far wider impact on many sectors, companies, which all use, sources of energy. And the effects of this transition away from carbon-intensive sectors and overall decarbonization will largely impact the majority of our funds and the constituent holding companies within that. And so, we've seen through the scenario analysis that understanding the underlying exposure at fund, sector, and ISIN level is important. And we really need to start as an industry quantifying that risk. And the best way to start is really by getting your hands on reporting and data available to you at a portfolio and sector and ISIN level.
So thanks, Scott. Really interesting, and it just shows how widespread carbon emissions are across all industries, but more importantly, how energy contributes to the total global carbon emissions. It's quite frightening, actually, and quite shocking. So, given the extent of the impact of high carbon, what data is actually available, on carbon emissions for trustees?
Yeah, so as I highlighted in one of the previous slides, data availability, and the methodology behind that data is imperfect at the moment, but there are frameworks out there that we can start to use today to get a head start on managing and monitoring those ESG and climate risks. And so if we're looking specifically at the TCFD, the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures requirements, there are bold ambitions within that of embedding climate change governance, strategy, risk management considerations into a scheme's overall investment process. However, the baseline to start all of that is really to get your hands on key metrics and set appropriate targets off the back of that in relation to things like total carbon emissions, total carbon footprint, and weighted average carbon intensity scores for your portfolio and the underlying funds that you hold, and underlying ISINs within those funds, from a scope 1, scope 2, and scope 3 carbon data perspective. And so, yeah, I think the direct and indirect data challenge, there are sort of issues with collecting direct and indirect carbon data. You know, scope 1 and 2 data is more available than scope 3 data. And certainly there are issues around data quality and availability of scope 3 data, as it's the most difficult challenge for companies and issuers to start to collect and report on. You know, it's a full sort of supply chain and sort of traceability issue for companies to understand the carbon that goes into the full life cycle of the products that they offer. And this is across all sectors. You know, it's not just from a car manufacturer or a food producer, for example, but it can even impact things like, you know, financials, where banks need to consider the sort of scope 3 emissions of their underlying investments in the companies that they issue money to. And emissions intensity can be calculated once you've got your hand on all that data, and you can start to set appropriate benchmarks and targets by industry, by sector, at a fund and portfolio level, once you get a start on collecting all that data. And so from our perspective and what we've seen so far, you know, the key challenges around varying methodologies to assess and report on that data are there, but having a sort of single source of truth report that covers your full portfolio or the full extent of your portfolio as much as possible on scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions can really give user scheme a head start and a baseline understanding of your overall sort of carbon risks and carbon metrics that then flow into the governance process that you need to start to build as a scheme as a part of managing climate change risks, and of course, TCFD reporting off the back of it as well. So Pat, with all that said, we've talked a lot about climate risk reporting. So, you know, as a trustee, how do you consider ESG risks within your own DC scheme?
Thanks, Scott. Next slide, please. So you're right, we've talked a lot about climate risks, but actually ESG is absolutely key for us to think about, and again, in respect of protecting those member pots. And we as trustees have actually put a lot of thought into it, and we've implemented our own governance program around ESG using a screening tool. We're very aware as a board that poor management of ESG risks can impact the share price of companies that we invest, both positively and negatively. And what I've done here on this slide is actually highlighted a few examples, both positive and negative. So first of all, let's start off with a positive one, under environment, Nike. I'm really impressed with this company. You know, a target of 0 carbon and 0 waste. They have very aggressive targets set for 2025. For example, they've got a target of reducing carbon emissions by 70% in their facilities. That's by using 100% renewable energy and all electric vehicles. They also focus on low carbon materials. For example, a material called Flyknit. It's a lightweight material. And this material reduces manufacturing process waste by about 60% over traditional equivalent materials. Nike share price is up by 36% in the last year. A great example, a positive one. Then I move over to social, and I'm going to pick on a negative one now. Boohoo, a fast fashion retailer that was recently in the papers for some damning reports about labour conditions in factories in Leicester where they're said to be making clothes for the companies. The news really centred around paying less than the minimum wage and forced labour. Their share price fell by 49%. And still now in June 2021, the share price is 20% below the share price in June 2020. And then I go on to one under governance, which is negative, but also has a positive side to it as well. And that's the infamous VW emissions scandal in 2015. When that scandal was revealed, the share price fell by 61%. However, after a complete overhaul of the management of VW, really including the leadership and the culture, which were identified as the key factors towards the scandal, the share price has recovered. However, it's still 17% below its peak. So 5 years on, that company is still impacted. So, Scott, these are some examples of positive and negative, but as a data expert, what potential frameworks can you actually recommend to trustees around managing ESG risks?
Well, Pat, I think the governance requirements to manage and monitor the ESG risks associated with your portfolio and underlying investments is clear. That's through the SIP and implementation statement in actively managing and monitoring your asset managers to make sure that the funds that you're invested in are in line with your ESG strategy as a pension scheme. And we really think that simple and easy to understand ESG reports with good data can be a great entry point for schemes to better understand their overall ESG risks. And to speak specifically about a potential framework related to managing ESG risks, we always lean back on the UNPRI, the Principles for Responsible Investment. And within the UNPRI, if you're a signatory, there are 6 key principles to look at. And principle 3 highlights that we as a signatory will seek to appropriately disclose on ESG issues by the entities in which we invest in. And that principle 3 links to assessing your overall portfolio against things like the UN Global Compact, which is a set of 10 key principles related to the topic of ESG. Those 10 principles cover norm areas such as human rights, labor rights, the environment, and anti-corruption and governance issues. And what you can start to do as a scheme is, if you're sort of signed up to that UNPRI, UN Global Compact framework, you can start to, if with the data available, assess your overall portfolio, funds you invest in, and the underlying ISINs to see if there are any E, S, or G breaches in relation to the companies that you invest in. And any breaches, will be flagged at whatever frequency you'd like as a scheme. So you can start to identify, manage, and monitor those risks, of understanding your overall exposure. And once you've got your hands on that data, you can really start to investigate and challenge the asset managers on, one, has that breach been identified by the asset manager itself? 2, how are they looking to manage and monitor that? And 3, does that breach and does that underlying holding within the fund fit with my overall investment strategy as a scheme? And so getting your hands on data as soon as possible to start to identify those breaches and start to manage those risks is really important, fitting in with that sort of responsible investment strategy and good governance process that you can start to build as a scheme. And so, Pat, with all that, as a trustee, what type of reporting do you think you'd be looking for?
Good question, Scott. So, but as a trustee, what I really want is I want something simple. I want it to be easy to understand for the entire trustee board. I want it to be consistent. So I want to compare apples for apples. So it's got to be high level reporting to really highlight to me any of the key ESG or climate risks to the scheme. But I want this at total level, to have a total view, but ideally also by fund or segregated mandate. And if I'm investing in pooled funds, I want to look through as well into those pooled funds so I can identify those risks within the pooled funds. And also, I suppose at the end, really what I want to be able to do is drill down to that security if there's some risks that have been highlighted to me. So that's really what I want as a trustee. So is that really doable, Scott?
Yeah, so that's really interesting to hear that you'd like, a sort of report that looks at it at a sort of overall portfolio level with the ability to drill down into the underlying detail if you'd like to. And, with the tools out there available today, you can, as a pension fund trustee and as a scheme, start to connect with service providers and ESG data vendors to start to identify those ESG risks and breaches, and as well as that carbon data and metrics to make sure that you're lining with yourselves with that you're arming yourselves with all the data needed as a part of that sort of sustainable governance process that you're starting to develop as a scheme. And so, we talked a lot about the ESG risks in standards such as the UN Global Compact and identifying any breaches in relation to that at a portfolio, fund, and ISIN level. A similar thing can be done for carbon data and metrics as well, in line with the TCFD requirements to report on total carbon footprint, total emissions, and weighted average carbon intensity scores, all including scope 1, 2, and 3 data. And we've talked about the data availability issues there, but I think the bottom line is, you want to start to integrate, well, first of all, get your hands on this data and start to integrate this new data into your overall governance process as a scheme, and prompt your service providers on engagement when you find things are out of line with expectations. And I think an independent perspective is key. Again, strengthening and that sort of robust governance process, especially when you start to assess your scheme, your asset managers, and challenge them on the data that you find and the results that you find in relation to your overall exposure and risks.
Okay, Scott, I think that's really useful, from an ESG perspective. But actually, what do you think would be useful for trustees for actually measuring exposure to carbon emissions? So what sort of reporting do you think would be useful to us?
Well, if we go on to the next slide, please. I think what this highlights is a sort of sample table of data that you can pull together as a scheme to look at those TCFD metrics that we've talked about. And we identified earlier in the presentation, carbon's everywhere. It's in all types of sectors, industries, and it'll likely impact a lot of your funds and a lot of the underlying holding companies within those funds. And so being able to pull carbon data from a scope 1, 2, 3 perspective across sector, across company, will be a really important part of that overall TCFD reporting and risk management process as a scheme dealing with climate change risks in the future. And the statutory guidance highlights that although there are issues with data quality around carbon data, work as far as you are able as a scheme and really make a start on starting to collect that data across your portfolio. So Pat, I think it's been a great session today. It's good to be here on with you, and we've covered a lot, but what would you surmise as your key takeaways from today?
Scott, I agree. So thank you very much. You've provided us with some great insight, and also thank you to Mel as well for some insight on the CTI. So really, what I've got here is I've got 5 goals for trustees to ensure that we better protect member pots by using, some of the sustainable governance toolkits which are available to us as trustees. So, number 1, get your hands, and I think you've heard Scott say this, get your hands on some independent data and reporting for cost transparency, ESG, and climate risk. Talk to your asset managers and set expectations. Ensure that you as a board of trustees have an ongoing governance framework of cost transparency, so managing those costs, and of the ESG and climate risks and opportunities within your portfolios. Inquire if your asset managers are compliant with TCFD and SASB standards. And I leave, last but not least, inform your members about how you trustees are particularly managing ESG and climate risks. And I think just to round off, I like Scott saying, is think big, start small, but most importantly, start. Thank you very much, everybody.
Thank you so much, Pat and Scott, for that presentation. I think it's fair to say we covered a fair amount of ground there. We've got quite a number of questions that have come in, and we've got maybe about 10 minutes or so before the end of the session. So I'll try and make it through as many of them as I can. Scott has very kindly agreed to stay on just to take some of the questions. So as I say, I'll try and work through some of those. If I can maybe just start by going back to the beginning of the presentation when we were focused on cost transparency. I mean, it was quite a stark statistic you had there, that which is 1 in 10 of it was after sort of upon scrutiny, sorry, about 1 in 10 of data sets were not accurate at the first shot, and on average they went up about 25%. I just wonder, I mean, what's the reasons for that? What do you find is driving that?
Yeah, so I think the key thing on cost transparency and the cost transparency initiative templates at the moment is that there are still teething issues in transferring that data from asset management systems to asset owners to get that full view of what the CTI template is looking for. As I mentioned, there's the CTI template is quite ambitious in the amount of data that it covers, and there can be mistakes in the data that is sent over. And so, what we really see as a part of good governance around cost transparency initiative templates and the data is really, querying all the relevant fields within the cost transparency initiative data to make sure that it is as accurate as possible before that data is then, passed on to reporting or passed on into trustee reports. And I think that's a really important part of a sort of good governance process around cost transparency, and really balancing. The thing is, you've got to balance, reporting deadlines on one hand, and as well as that, the data quality. And it's sort of the combination of the two through a mixture of technology and sort of hands-on analysis that can help, have that a sort of concrete governance process that helps you get an accurate CTI template on time as well. So, our findings are quite stark in that if you ask the right questions, you can, get more, cost data revealed, which, it shouldn't be that way at the moment, but it currently is. And so, there's real value in asking those finer questions when you receive that data from your asset managers.
Yeah. If I could move on to ESG, which is very much the topic of the moment. So a couple of the questions that we've had through is sort of focusing on who ought to or who is best to provide the data. So obviously at the moment, as you know, we're facing the first TCFD deadline this October. We actually seen the regulations published on that yesterday. Unless it's happened in the last hour, we still haven't seen the consultation that will require asset managers to report to a similar standard. And as you say, as was sort of outlined in your presentation, and we've done work on this as well, there's a lot of frustration at the availability of that data. So we've had a challenge from the box that says surely asset managers should be providing that data. And I just wonder, I mean, I think we can all agree on that, but I just wonder from your perspective, do you think an independent provider is a more efficient way or a more comprehensive means of gathering that data?
Yeah, so on the data challenges around ESG, the thing I'd say is that, there isn't a one size fits all approach to getting ESG data. Each scheme will have its own specific nuances and preferences in terms of how it receives that ESG data across its portfolio. Some pension schemes will go direct to an ESG data provider and sort of plug that ESG data into their systems to then manage those ESG risks and better understand those climate change metrics as well as a part of the sort of TCFD. So we're seeing that in practice. And some are also relying on their asset manager to pull data and relevant data within the reports. And I think the tricky part around relying solely on your asset manager for understanding your ESG risks and your climate change risks is, what happens in a situation where you have multiple managers who are using different ESG data providers with different ESG methodologies, rating methodologies, and sort of data gathering methodologies. And so, in an example where a scheme employs 10 external asset managers, you're potentially receiving 10 different reports with 10 different methodologies, and you as a scheme and as a trustee have to sort of collate all that data into one report that makes sense, covering your ESG risks and your, TCFD metrics and targets that you're trying to set. And so, from our perspective and what we've seen in the industry, and particularly in our experience in the Netherlands with Dutch pension schemes, is that there is value in sort of single source of truth reporting and having that independent and objective approach to understanding what your ESG risks and climate change risks are. It's part of a sort of best-in-class governance model, if you want to call it that way. And that objectivity just makes sure that the asset managers aren't marking their own homework in a way. And currently, with the way that ESG data standards are and ESG data methodologies are, it isn't standardized across the board. That is one of the issues, a sort of data governance issue. And I'm sure, further down the line with a bit more regulation around this data, things will become more standardized, and you could rely on, a single source, such as your asset manager or investment advisor, to pull all that data, because it's all, sent across in a like-for-like basis. But I think as we stand in what we're seeing in practice today, there is real value in one, objective and independent reporting, and as well as that, a sort of single source of truth. And so, my recommendation there would be to, speak to your service provider, speak to your asset manager, speak to your custodian, speak to your investment consultants, and see what data you can get your hands on, and see if those methodologies behind the data that's being sent across, fit in line with what your expectations are, and if they'll meet your reporting obligations as well.
Yeah, that actually probably covers what was going to be my next question, which was one for Gordon, who just sort of asked your thoughts on the absence of objective, independent ESG metrics, which would support compare and contrast exercises. And as you say, we seem to be heading towards a place where there'll be better standardization. I think just this morning, in fact, the Treasury has announced a new working group on a green taxonomy, but it doesn't feel like it's going to be in place come October. So we'll see where that goes. I mean, one thing I wanted to ask you from your presentation was there was a slide where you referred to scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions, with scope 3 obviously being referring to supply chain, which I think is a phrase that strikes fear into the heart of every trustee. I just wonder, how important do you think scope 3 is, and also how easy is it to have access to that information?
Well, the simple answer is it's very important, and it's also very difficult to collect. Data availability is, a key issue and a real concern of schemes at the moment in light of, the TCFD requirements. And luckily, I think, the outcomes of the recent paper from the DWP start to highlight they are aware of those concerns around Scope 3 data, and they're taking a more of a relaxed stance on collecting and reporting that Scope 3 data, at least for the first year worth of reporting for schemes, which I think it will be music to some schemes' ears, because Scope 3 data does account for the majority of emissions. It depends what sector you're involved in, surely, but it covers all things throughout the supply chain. And if you're thinking about transportation of goods, if you're thinking about your financial companies within your portfolios, and what loans they give out to particular companies and the knock-on effect that has on Scope 3, it makes up a large majority of the total emissions base, but availability and reporting standards are just not 100% there yet. And what we've seen on the ground with ESG data providers is a lot of sort of estimations and modeling of Scope 3 data that is going on, based off generic industry scores. And so I think that fits nicely in with another DWP recommendation in terms of having that best endeavors approach, or working as far as you are able, in quotation marks, because they understand the challenges around data availability at the moment. And so having that 1 year buffer I think is great, and that gives time for the industry schemes and the underlying sort of holding companies to really push for Scope 3 emissions and fight for change in that area and improving the overall availability of that data being passed on to reports, because it will be a must-have of TCFD reporting metrics and targets, and then that has a knock-on effect on everything else you're doing around governance and strategy and managing those net zero targets if you've got one, for example.
Yeah. Maybe just one more question. We're quickly running out of time, so apologies if we haven't made it to your question. I'm just going to ask one more. I don't know how easy it will be to answer this one, Scott, so apologies if it's not, but it's one from Mark, who says, you identified 2 elements of risk associated with climate change: physical risk and transition risk. Measurement and reporting of carbon intensity addresses the latter. How would you suggest trustees incorporate the technical, or I think he means maybe transition risk of climate change?
So addressing, the implications of physical risks and transition risks, I think is really embedded within this scenario analysis that the TCFD are, trying to promote. And I think, I highlighted a paper earlier in the seminar today around how, current actuarial models aren't currently factoring in the full extent of physical risks and transition risks associated with climate change. And I think, basically modeling the sort of overall impact that climate change risks has on GDP, and also the implications that has on the assets and liabilities of your overall portfolio is an important thing that needs to start to be embedded in to the overall sort of risk management process of a scheme. And that's, right in line with what's being asked for in the TCFD. But I think the baseline of that and how we get to that point in really quantifying the effects is getting the hands on the data. I think that's the really key thing. And without having that baseline understanding of as a scheme of where you are exposed from an ESG perspective, and as well as that from a overall carbon metrics perspective, you can't do all that good, nice risk management analysis without having that baseline understanding. And so, the key message there is to, get your hands on as much data as possible. Make sure that the ESG data vendors that you're looking at have a wide range of coverage, a good methodology that you agree on, and reporting that's easy to understand. Yeah. And then that will eventually feed back into, your risk management and scenario analysis that needs to be incorporated as a part of your TCFD requirements.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Scott, in particular, for the questions there, but also Pat, who the presentation, and thanks to everyone for joining us today. That's been a really good session, and apologies we didn't have more time to explore some of these issues. Just to say, as Scott mentioned earlier in his presentation, there's a Made Simple guide on cost transparency. It's available on our website. There's also some other CASIS events that we've done if you want to dip into some of those, and we'll have an entire conference on these issues on the 30th of June, which I think I'm right in saying, Scott, you're joining us for a session during that, I think the 1st of July. So hopefully we'll see you all there. And thanks again for joining us, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your day.